Some of a certain age will remember a sitcom back in the 1960s called Never Mind the Quality, Feel the Width. It features a Jewish tailor, Manny Cohen, and he advertises for a partner in his tailoring business, and a decidedly non-Jewish Patrick Kelly turns up, played by the actor Joe Lynch, and he answers the application, and Manny, of course, is expecting a Jewish partner. So when challenged as to his ethnicity, Kelly says, "Have you not heard of an Irish Jew?" To which Manny replies, "Yes, it's thick and meaty with potatoes and vegetables in it." The point being my multiple identities. I'm actually English, born of Irish parents, Catholic. I count my Irish inheritance as very important to me. And insofar as my Christianity and our Christianity needs to be messianic in order to be authentic, then there is a claim to Jewish heritage also. We are compelled to affirm and to claim a Jewish identity and to think in terms of emancipation and empowerment in Jewish categories, which will become hopefully clear as we move into the presentation. The Irish stew, of course, is made with lamb, and so the lamb is there, but perhaps a little bit hidden. And how do we enable the lamb to be seen, following, and what it is? We've been talking a lot about Girard, and hopefully the basics of the theory are available for everybody. Before I move into the presentation, I just want to kind of pick up one or two things coming out of the discussion at the end there. Very, very rich reflections sparked off by Duncan. Just a recognition that increasingly there probably needs to be a distinction between Girardian theory and mimetic theory. Girard himself was 90 last Christmas Day, and for some people that explains everything. The fact he's born on Christmas Day and had to share his birthday presents with Jesus possibly explains everything one needs to know. But he is 90 and he will not be around for a great deal longer, so anybody with questions about his thought, well, even now it's difficult to really question him because I think he's past really thinking about things very clearly, but he won't be around to answer them. And there will be there already are, a variety of mimetic theories, different stresses, different emphases, and some of those will go beyond Girard, some of those will work with Girard in different ways, answering questions not necessarily posed by him, and Arpad gave us an example of that this morning. But it's very interesting to see the Girardian community working with that reality, everybody trying to be as non-mimetic as possible, because we'll recognise this, and they're all saying, oh, we're not going to be like Freudians when Freud died, we're going to stay together. But you see the different pressures, the different temptations to be the authentic heirs, or the spokesperson for the true theory and so on. And I think there are different stresses and different emphases. I think Girardian mimetic theory has a different feel if you're reading it in the United States than it does in Europe. I think it's interesting to read it as a Catholic theologian as opposed to somebody from Reformed tradition. There are different things that we read in this theory, and I think the task is to try and identify those different flavours, different emphases, and still work together for a kind of common insight. I'll perhaps come back to that, but I think part of what I maybe want to do today, and I'm not quite sure, I wasn't planning to do this quite as explicitly as I will hope to do, but one of the areas where one has to be ready, it seems to me, to think in terms of mimetic theory around Girardian theory is, of course, to disagree with Girard. And one of the things that was coming up at the end, and I might have time to look at it today, was this curious last book, which somebody has already mentioned, it's pretty kind of depressing reading, the apocalyptic stuff. What do we do with that? How do we read that? In some ways it seems to be a departure from what was there before. In other ways it seems to be a continuation. It seems to be an intensification of themes that perhaps were not quite so explicit. And it seems to me there are particular challenges arising out of battling to the end. And the point that I would make that why we need to kind of accept very seriously the kind of apocalyptic framework of that book, the idea that warfare is no longer going to be the sacrificial mechanism that saved us in the past. This is no longer the case. I think it's a very important thesis which we need to take seriously. But on the other hand, it's possible to suggest that a lot of Girard's anxiety, as expresses in that book, dates to some extent, I think, to his uncomfortableness in a post-9/11 scenario. Like many Americans, I think he's suddenly finding the world doesn't seem to be as explicable as it might have been previously. And in particular, chapter 5 of his book, where he talks about his fascination with the poet Friedrich Hölderlin, I think is a very, very interesting chapter. It's very self-revelatory about Girard's own kind of psychology. He's very kind of confessional, and in some ways, I suspect he would have much rather have written a book on Hölderlin with a chapter on Clausewitz rather than the other way around. That's just a kind of personal theory, and I'd like to kind of maybe have time to look at that a bit later on. But it's possible that we might want to kind of question some of the aspects of that later phase in Girard, as indeed we may want to question other aspects, as we've heard today. And I've found this comes very helpful in that it's been very positive in the readiness to engage with Girard in a critical but positive way. That's been, it's not always the case that happens, and when it does happen, it's very, very gratifying. We've talked about the theory in its general terms, and just to emphasize some aspects of that. First of all, the two problematic aspects of human desiring: the derived nature of our desires and their volatility. The derived nature of our desires and their volatility. To put that theologically, Augustine talks about our hearts being restless till they rest in thee, O Lord. So these two qualities, the interdependence of our desires and their instability, together are a recipe for conflict. And when we deny this situation by means of sedimented myths of romantic autonomy, the potential for catastrophe is increased, precisely because we are now more inclined to mistake the ailment for the cure. We think that what we need is to be more autonomous rather than less, that somehow the resolution of our situation will involve us being more self-assertive, more autonomous, rather than recognizing our radical intersubjectivity. This is the unwitting paradox of the most annoying song in the planet, of course, John Lennon's Imagine. We were talking earlier on about effacement of relationships, effacement of the human, the idea that simply erasing and undifferentiating everything that makes us human beings will enable us to arrive at a kind of dystopia of peaceful coexistence is obviously nonsense to a Girardian. That song spells out dystopia rather than a utopia. It's easy enough to see Girard's hypothesis at work on the level of the individual's alleged herd-like instincts. One of the principal financial backers of Girardian activities at this time is the Californian billionaire Peter Thiel, who has a sustained interest in mimetic phenomena and social media. Thiel is a former pupil of Girard, I think I'm right in saying. He's one of the initial backers of Facebook. He's the founder of PayPal. So he's interested in what human beings do in societies and in social groups, and the necessity of having as many friends as possible is one of the kind of instances, if you like, of kind of mimetic phenomenon. And just occasionally he opens his purse strings and finances various Girardian initiatives, but then not always. So our exposure as puppets of desire is ruthlessly carried out by Miranda Presley, the fashion queen played by Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada. I came across a website that said that if you want to understand Girard's theory, watch this movie. And you remember the scene where Meryl Streep, as the fashion queen, is dressing down. She's telling off the character played by Anne Hathaway, who thinks that she has nothing to do with fashion, that she's completely independent of any kind of advertising and influence of fashion gurus and so on. I put on my Meryl Streep impersonation. This stuff. Oh, okay, you see. I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. What you don't know is that that sweater is not just blue. It's not turquoise. It's not lapis, it's actually Cyrillian. And you're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of Cyrillian gowns. And I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed Cyrillian military jackets. And then Cyrillian quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you, no doubt, fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars, and it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff. So that's on an individual basis. We follow the kind of argument there. My main focus is the work of Girard in terms of political theology and trying to address the 3 questions around which this conference was organised in terms of the flyer. If you remember, is the idea of political theology a helpful one in relation to addressing actual situations of conflict and community-scale violence? How might we attempt such a definition? And then thirdly, does Girard provide a key in the concepts of mimesis and sacrifice which can carry us beyond Schmittian friend-enemy patterns of locked-in violence? We haven't hardly mentioned Schmitt today, we'll mention him a little bit here. So in terms of those 3 questions, is the idea of political theology helpful? My answer would be yes. Political theology is an indispensable category. With regard to the second question, can we attempt a definition of political theology? I'm not sure that that's the best use of our time at the moment, and that gets very kind of complicated. But with regard to the third question, I would want to specify Girard's contribution in terms of a syllogism. First of all, the social and political sciences have been compelled over recent decades to incorporate a global return or recrudescence of religion into their analyses, the alleged return of the theopolitical, thus drawing back from premature and largely discredited theories of secularization. So that's return of the religion is the first premise, if you like. Second proposition, that Girard's mimetic theory, as an exploration of the role of sacralized desire and violence in human societies, is a broadly credible paradigm for understanding processes of social formation. Therefore, the conclusion that Girard's mimetic theory has a distinctive contribution to make to contemporary political thought. So the answer is that I think there is a contribution to be made. And that's as philosophical as I get in terms of that attempt at logic. Now, to some extent, this is to read Girard against the grain. On the whole, Girard has shied away from political explanation. He engages directly and polemically with Hegel, with Freud, with Nietzsche, but he's shown little interest in Karl Marx. There is also then the matter of the apocalyptic turn in Girard's later writing, above all in Achevé Clausewitz, translated as Battling to the End, the English translation 2010. This bizarre book, this is Girard's own word, draws on the theorist, Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz to set out an apocalyptical historical thesis about the seriousness of the crisis that faces our contemporary world. And in some ways, there's a kind of anti-political move there. And Girard at a conference in California in 2008, I think it was, the conference was entitled Politics and Catastrophe. And it was actually in a rather nice hotel in Riverside, California. So there's a bit of a paradox there about a bit of a disjunction. But Girard said in one sentence, politics can no longer save us. They are beyond politics. It was quite a shocking statement to hear put it across so boldly. So that's a question there of what exactly is going on with that kind of pronouncement, and why is it precisely that politics is no longer salvific, no longer something we can hope for. So, in his long career, he's worked as a literary critic, a historian, an armchair anthropologist, and an amateur theologian, but not as a political theorist directly. And yet it is difficult to understand Girard's work outside the terms of Carl Schmitt's dictum that allegedly secular political concepts are ultimately derived from religious meanings and commitments. That's in terms of the origins of the political, mimetic theory insists on an attentiveness to the paradox of violence and social formation. Girard locates the genesis of major political institutions, such as kingship, the death penalty, in the victimage mechanism. In Violence and sacred kingship is seen as a deferred or delayed scapegoating. And in the analogy with Hobbes' Leviathan, the violent snowballing effect of a community's war of all against all leads to the choosing of a sovereign, contractually endowed with a monopoly of violence so as to preserve the community from itself. So there's a very close affinity between what Girard is saying and what Hobbes seems to be saying. The exceptional nature of the sovereign, set apart from the community as well as above it, is further elaborated in the decisionism of Carl Schmitt and in Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction. So Girard's theory seems to be framed initially in a Schmittian problematic, and this is a bit unpromising because the third of our questions was, can we go beyond Schmitt? Can we avoid Schmitt's description of politics in terms of friend-enemy patterns of locked-in violence? We can try and simply deny Schmitt's assertion that the friend-enemy distinction is fundamental and therefore find a different starting point for doing political theology. And a number of political theologians are trying to do that, saying, why are we allowing Schmitt to determine the situation here? But it's difficult for Girardians to make that move, since the affinities between a Schmittian diagnosis requires that Schmitt's disturbing analysis be tackled head-on. A little aside here, marvellous quotation from Jakob Taubes, the Jewish philosopher of religion, who was actually an unlikely conversation with Carl Schmitt. We're talking about Carl Schmitt as a kind of legal theorist, very much snarled up with the Nazi regime, and his diagnoses are therefore extremely problematic in terms of how much are they mixed up with his own kind of political commitments. But Jakob Taubes has a startling description. He says, what have Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger and Adolf Hitler got in common? And she says, they're all Catholics gone stale. Just leave that one hanging there. It's an interesting description. I propose a brief characterization of the political Girard in terms of three trajectories. I think there's a Hegelian trajectory, an Augustinian trajectory, which incorporates the Schmittian moment, and thirdly, a Pauline trajectory. Now we can look at these synchronically as a double palimpsest, if you like. These are layered upon one another, or we can look at them diachronically as three moments or phases in Girard's intellectual career. What I want to do is to try and talk about the differences between those three as a way of answering that third question. Are we committed to a kind of Schmittian framework? And my position is that that Schmittian framework is overlaid by another one. I will then briefly refer to two resources which I've found very helpful as a kind of template for how to use Girardian mimetic theory in specific situations. Neither is particularly recent, but each presents a template of how we might make responsible use of Girard's hypothesis. Mark Juergensmeyer's book from 1992, Violence and the Sacred in the Modern World, is a series of case studies trying to say, does this work in this particular situation, and here and here? How does it work? Which bits of the theory are helpful? Which bits are less than helpful? And a series of case studies, none of which include Northern Ireland, sadly, but there's recognition of, or an analysis of the situation in Lebanon, in extreme white politics in Israel, and so on and so on. And an attempt to look at how this theory might work in the modern world, in the real world. And the second is an essay from 1997 from Byron Bland, entitled Marching and Rising, The Ritual of Small Differences and Great Violence. And that still remains to be one of the best examples I've come across of someone using Girard to understand a particular situation in conjunction with other theoretical approaches. So I'm going to briefly refer to those and how they might illustrate how the stuff might actually be useful on the ground. And then, if we have time, we'll refer to the questions from Battling in the End, this apocalyptic term, what do we make of that? which I'm possibly trying to rephrase as a Pauline term. Maybe that enables us to kind of make more sense of what's talking about. But it's within the context of that book that we have to decide whether Girard is offering an anti-political theology rather than a political theology. Very briefly, it's difficult not to read Girard on desire without thinking of Hegel's struggle for recognition, the contest between master and slave for the desire, the attention of the other. I would say probably only Sigmund Freud plays a more significant role in the development of Girard's thought than the presence of Hegel. And you think of Alexandre Koziev's lectures on Hegel in Paris between 1933 and 1939, very influential on a whole generation of thinkers. Girard came a little bit later, but he's reading those lectures in the late 50s when he's writing his book on desire. So Hegel's in the background, at least Koziev's understanding of Hegel. The struggle for recognition between two self-consciousnesses. This is the motor of the master-slave dialectic, explicated by Kojève as desire according to the other. To quote Kojève, human history is the history of desires that are desired. Namely, I desire, you should desire me. You should recognize me. You should acknowledge me. Of course, the difference with Girard, that he's not saying that I desire, you should desire me, but the desiring subject desires what the model desires, not the model himself. So there's a triangular component to Girard, which is not there in Hegel. So there's a crucial difference between those two. The other difference, Girard is not a Hegelian. He distances himself from Hegel's ontologization of violence, Hegel's placement of violence at the center of his system. Girard insists instead on the non-dialectical nature of human interaction. Or to be more precise, he argues for a novelistic dialectic, and by which he means the process of enlightenment and conversion in the novels of Proust, Dostoevsky, etc., etc., as explored in his first book. His first book is about 5 important European novelists and the way in which the symbolism of religious transcendence and desire interact in those novels. Entangled desires of the characters are oriented towards a difficult conversion from false to true transcendence. The model of desire being explored here is not Hegelian, but Augustinian. I suppose what I'm picking up here is the importance of the category of conversion in Girard's work. And quite literally, in 1959, he experienced a religious conversion when he was reading this stuff. At first, a kind of intellectual conversion, a kind of recognition that Christianity perhaps had more to say for itself than he'd realized when he gave up his faith 20 years prior to that. But then a very real conversion when he suddenly had a health scare. He had a skin cancer problem and he thought he was going to die, and that basically, bluntly, scared the crap out of him, and he found himself going back to church. And he returns to Catholicism in that year. But that novelist, that literary conversion and the existential religious conversion go together, and that concept of conversion is made more explicit in the book Evolution and Conversion, which is the book that came before Battle to the End, where he talks very openly about conversion as an important category. So we're not talking about a kind of Hegelian dialectic, we're talking about something more like what we find in Augustine, the concept of conversion. And from Augustine we've got the two cities tradition of political theology, which in modernity finds a kind of secularized and debased expression in Thomas Hobbes, and in the 20th century reincarnation of Thomas Hobbes, namely Carl Schmitt. As we know in Leviathan, Hobbes offers an etiology of kingship and sovereignty, which derives from a concurrence with Augustine about the wretchedness of human beings in their natural state. I know I'm reading Augustine in a particularly slanted way here. Not everybody would agree that Augustine has this pessimistic view of human beings. That's a fairly widespread understanding of Augustine, that basically human beings are pretty wild, left to themselves, they need to be kept in check. The catechonic significance of that, the katechon, the restraining power, is what politics is all about. That human beings need to be restrained from killing one another, and of course in Hobbes's account, it's the state that does the restraining. There is, of course, the link in Hobbes with the crisis of undifferentiation. It's precisely because human beings are equal that we have equal desires, and that's the recipe for disaster. If we were unequal, if we were notably hierarchically structured, there would be no competition. But because we're equal, we enter into competition with one another. And it's Christianity that's the problem with that, because Christianity preaches that all men and women are equal. That engenders equality of hope, which breeds envy, and ultimately universal competition and strife. And therefore the role of the state is to be a katekon, a restraining force against the tide of unlimited destructive violence. And the katekon, the Greek term, has New Testament provenance. It features in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, and in chapter 20, Revelation chapter, where Michael is wrestling with Satan and restraining him and casting him into the depths. There's an evident similarity between Girard and Hobbes, but the differences are also very important. And Girard wants to stress that the solution, according to mimetic theory, to the problem of undifferentiated violence, the solution is a war of all against one, the victim, while in the Leviathan we have a war of one against all. It's the sovereign who retains the unlimited right to force. What's the difference between these two? Mimetic theory posits a spontaneous mechanism, while classical social contract theory makes an unlikely assumption of rationality. Girard is very funny, scoffing at the enlightened doctrine of a social contract. He says, well, only an Englishman could come up with this kind of thing. And he does this lovely skit of a group involved in a conflict, and they're at the point of killing one another, and then somebody says, stop. Let us stop and have a cup of tea and sort out our differences. And we'll identify a sovereign who can be sovereign over us, and then we'll not fight anymore. This is unlikely that a group precisely caught up in the paroxysm of violence is going to kind of solve its problems in this very English rational way. Much more plausible, Girard argues, is that a community vents its aggression or realigns its aggression more spontaneously onto a marginal individual or group. With the identification and the expulsion of a scapegoat, the community's unanimity, -1, has been restored, the equilibrium has been restored. Quote, it is after all much easier to choose a victim than a sovereign. And again, his view that monarchy is more likely to evolve gradually from a divine victim awaiting sacrifice to a ruler who over time acquires real power. You treat your victims with respect, and then over time they acquire power, and then they take on this symbolic significance. Moving on then 3 centuries, the key notions in Carl Schmitt's political theology, state of exception, the katekon, the Freund-Feind distinction, friend-enemy, all have resonances in mimetic theory. And Wolfgang Paulver and other Girardians have demonstrated the kind of affinities. Like Hobbes, Schmitt attempts an appropriation of the language and concepts of Christianity. Schmitt sets out the roots of sovereignty as a secularized theological concept. And he also defines politics, and the concept of the political, he defines politics in terms of the Freund-Feind distinction. And for Schmitt, this difference is biblically validated. He takes examples like the Tower of Babel story, where it is God's will that there should be divisions between people. And any attempt at reconciliation is an upsetting of the balance between states. Any attempt at reconciliation is a misguided attempt to kind of resolve, which will merely exacerbate the problems. Again, a bit like John Lennon. That's why he set his face against the League of Nations and any kind of international cooperation at that level. Schmitt refuses to allow the apparent harmonizing neutrality of the modern liberal state to mask the brutal reality of the modern revolt against God. Paulver and others recognize the inadequacy of Schmitt's version of political Christianity, but they recognize the power of his diagnosis. What is required is a theological critique which will respond to the genuine concern expressed in Schmitt's arguments, namely the fear of undifferentiation, which is at the origin of both religion and politics, which always threatens to engulf and appropriate an authentic evangelical political vision. And Palver argues that Girard can contribute to that theological framework, a kind of corrective, if you like, of those aspects of Schmidt that are unacceptable. However, there's a further twist insofar as we've had to register our advance into a post-Westphalian era. We heard earlier on about the attempt to resolve our problems territorially, the cuis regio eus religio, idea of separating warring factions so that at least the possibility of coexistence can be established if we just have our own kind of specs, and recognitions of the problems in Northern Ireland is that hasn't happened. The geopolitical resolution of the alleged wars of religion in early modernity no longer applies. In Battling to the End, Girard takes up Clausewitz's argument that the mass mobilization of populations for warfare, symbolized by the Napoleonic armies of 1806. He sees 1806 as a crucial year. That's the year Napoleon appeared in Jena, the world's spirit on horseback. It's also the year that Friedrich Hölderlin lost his sanity. These developments, this mass mobilization of populations, will lead to a negation of war's catechonic function. That war will no longer function as a way of keeping ourselves from destruction. War is no longer effective as a sacrifice. In other words, it can no longer protect the massive population from destruction. This becomes evident when we consider the threat from contemporary terrorism, which every citizen has become a potential combatant. Every citizen is on the front line. Whether we decide that society is underpinned by a social contract which affords us protection, or by a scapegoating mechanism which yields an illusion of solidarity, in each case the presuppositions of an Augustinian for a Hobbesian security no longer hold. Just an interesting corollary to some of the points being made in this idea of war no longer doing its job. A conference I was at last year looking at Girard and political theology, one of the papers identified two aspects of contemporary warfare which really are quite disturbing in their implications. One is the idea of drone warfare, where war can be conducted from a distance, and as we know the issues around that. And interesting question that can somebody be a war hero if he or she is operating a computer all day and killing people from a distance, but not actually putting their life at risk? And then the other is the kind of privatization of war, getting militias to fight your wars instead of putting an army out there, and then you have to look after the people when they come back and they're mutilated or they need counselling, whatever. Much better to kind of privatize that. And that idea of warfare no longer being a contract between the citizen and the state. That kind of sacrificial element is the fact that you were prepared to lay down your life for the country, for the transcendent reality there. If that's breaking down, then what is happening to warfare and how we think of warfare and so on. So just again, interesting Girardian implications there. So we come then to a third moment in Girardian political theology, being referred to as an apocalyptic turn, which is a development that seems to me to have caused some consternation and require careful analysis. And I wonder whether it's better to think of this as a Pauline moment, for reasons I'll explain. It seems to be an intensification of some of the aspects of the Augustinian dimension. There's a heightened sense of urgency. Girard follows Clausewitz in describing this escalation to extremes. He uses the language of apocalypse very seriously and puts it out there as a very real possibility for the human race. Violence, now globalized and loosened from its catechonic constraints, codified warfare in other words, threatens to engulf us totally. And if we cite Paul at this juncture, we invite comparison with the considerable interest in Paul as a political theologian, which begins with the lectures of Jakob Taubes, taken up by Alain Berdieu, Giorgio Agamben, Jean-Paul Zizek and others. Taubes' extraordinary lectures on the political theology of Paul were delivered against the backdrop of Taubes' unlikely conversations with Carl Schmitt, while Giorgio Agamben's work on the state of exception and the Homo Sacer take up directly where Schmitt is left off. It's So the point I'm making here is that there are an awful lot of people saying similar kind of things about the urgency of the time and the kind of the interest in the messianic and stuff, which means that maybe 20 years ago, Girard was using this kind of language and he would have sounded very eccentric and very odd. But somehow there's a whole swathe of thinkers, not all of whom by any means have made kind of faith commitments as we would understand it to Christianity or whatever, but are using the language and using the concepts, which puts him in interesting kind of company. Girard rejects the charge that he is a cultural pessimist, but he is clear that history is not carrying along at the same pace and rhythm as before. Specific aspects of our situation make it unique, and indeed uniquely dangerous. The decomposition of the sacred mechanism in the modern period instantiates this ambiguity, and how we react to the collapse of sacrificial safeguards will determine whether we have a future at all. To quote him from the 2007 book, the gospel does not provide a happy ending to our history. It simply shows us two options. And this is what ideologies never provide. They don't provide freedom of choice. Either we imitate Christ, giving up our mimetic violence, or we run the risk of self-destruction. The apocalyptic feeling is based on that risk. So it is an apocalypse, but it is an apocalypse in which we are still, if you like, in charge of our own affairs in terms of the choices we make. Ideologies do not give you a choice. For Girard, the problem with the present threat of militant Islam in the post-9/11 epoch is its complete unpredictability. I think one of the interesting things is to look at just how shaken Girard was, it seems to me, by the 9/11 catastrophe. Like, I guess, many Americans. We're now operating outside of humanistic categories. Most of Girard's work is written during the Cold War. There was a kind of perverted logic that held us together. That both the Russians and the Americans were operating within a humanistic logic, which meant that we never fully went the whole way of destroying ourselves. You could say we came pretty close, but you give the example of the missile crisis in 1963. That was averted because Khrushchev turned the other cheek. At the vital moment, Khrushchev turned the boats around. He acted in a Christian way that deflated the situation. And Girard's point would be that when you're dealing with an Islamist ideology that is prepared to operate on a cosmic level, in which people are prepared to kill themselves as well as others, you don't know what's going to happen. That humanistic logic no longer applies. And that's why I think he's really, to some extent, very, very nervous about the contemporary situation. As I mentioned in 2008, he said, we're beyond the point where politics can help us. The search for a political solution merely prolongs the illusion that we are in charge of things, that the world is predictable. You might actually say the same about the ecological crisis. There's a sense in which we seem to be pretty close to a tipping point where we are going to do irreparable damage that will be quite simply apocalyptic for many people in the world. And the politicians seem to be unable to get together and do something about that. It's not like the science fiction films where we're being invaded from Mars and all the nations get together to kind of defend ourselves and something works out. Somehow we're faced with a threat and we can't operate collectively to deal with it. My example would be the conference in Copenhagen where the world leaders got together, the facts were set before them, but nobody was actually able to take a political solution, put a political solution forward. Politics can't help us, given the scale of the threats that we're looking at. We need, says Girard, to think in a wider context, and in my view, this wider context is the apocalyptic dimension of Christianity. An interesting parallel seems to me between what Girard does with the term and the concept of sacrifice in his major writings in the 70s and 80s, and what he's doing with the term apocalypse. And he's interesting how he's drawing upon religious language to describe his insights. And whereas with sacrifice, he was very resistant to the term being used to describe Christianity, and eventually he comes around because he chats to some Jesuit theologians and they make him see sense. And he eventually comes around and says, oh yes, fine, okay, sacrifice can mean different things. And he comes to recognize that there's a difference between the Christian view of sacrifice and the pagan, say, the pagan sacrificial. And that's an important transition in Girard's work. Now he's talking about apocalypse, and he's full-bloodedly saying, apocalypse is what we're facing. He's not pulling punches at all, and he is presenting the Christian view of apocalypse as opposed to the kind of more lurid end of the world is nigh type of left behind rapture stuff. But he's very serious about using this terminology, and I think there's an interesting parallel between his use of the word sacrifice and his use of the word apocalypse, which we might come to. I want very briefly to mention two cases I want to call applied to Girard. Michael Kirwan convened a conference in 1989 and published a short book called Violence and the Sacred in the Modern World. And this brought scholars of the social sciences and comparative religion together with Girard to talk about his theory, to see whether it makes sense in real-life conflict situations. It seems to be an important thing to have done. It's not something that's been done a great deal, funnily enough. But it's one of the few occasions that Girard has been face-to-face with social scientists talking about his theory. And the mimetic desire and the sacrifice establishes the two linchpins of the theory. Interestingly enough, Organisers is someone who thinks that the importance of the Christian revelation, which is the third bit of it, can be detached from the theory, and that's one of the things that we discussed, that the theory makes sense without Girard's commitment to the biblical revelation, that there is a kind of coherence to talking about mimetic desire and sacrifice. So we had presentations of case studies from Shiite Lebanon, Zionist extremism in Israel, Sri Lanka, India, Indonesia, and several other places. And the presentations varied in their assessment of Girard's usefulness, and they also varied as to which bit of the theory they found important. Some people found the mimetic theory bit interesting, others found the sacrificial bit. Still others replaced parts of Girard's theories with other theories, or found that his work, to be appreciated, must be understood in a broader theoretical context. And that just takes place a kind of responsible use of the theory to kind of say, okay, it's not a kind of package that one simply accepts and then has to apply, but in particular situations, particular aspects of it may speak more clearly than others. To give an example of David Rappaport's essay in that volume, he gives 5 reasons why people think religion and violence go together, while religious violence will always be associated with violence. Girard's account is one of these 5, but there are others. Meyer offers the possibility, for example, that the fundamental notion is not sacrifice, but the quest for order, which always involves a struggle between order and disorder. But this quest for order, in fact, is more basic. And so there's an idea that can incorporate Girard's theory or sit alongside it, but is subtly different from it. For Girard, the notion of a cosmic or sacred warfare is the dominant motif that he wants to explore. Girard's main interest is in Indian religions, so he's trying to look at it from that perspective. The implication is that the Girardian hermeneutic is most effective if it is not used in a univocal or monopolistic explanation. None of the case studies mentioned look at Northern Ireland. I wish to refer briefly to one such case study which does exemplify for me the same subtlety and breadth of approach. And Byron Bland produced this essay in 1997. I'm glad to hear that Duncan thinks highly of Byron's work, because I think this is one of the most interesting essays that I've come across using a Girardian hermeneutic. He applies a mimetic analysis to the tragic events in Duncree, Portadown in 1996, when an escalation of violence around the Orange marching season brought a setback to the peace process. And here again, the relation between symbolic and real violence is what's at stake. That's one of the questions Jürgensmeyer puts. How does symbolic violence, how do images of violence relate to real violence? Because every religious tradition has very explicit, very graphic images of violence. And David took us through some of that, looking at crucifixion. How do symbolic representations of violence relate to real violence? Bland describes the effect of the controversy in Portadown. Just as the plucked string of a musical instrument sets all the others vibrating harmoniously, so the chord struck in Portadown sounded the key to a counterpoint that seemed almost primordial. How, in short, did a dispute about nothing so quickly become a dispute about everything? Bland turns to Girard to propose that the mimetic doubling of the Orange Marchers and Catholic resistors caused the standoff, a standoff which keeps being ritualistically replicated. So I quote, "Caught in a tragedy replayed thousands of times, Catholics and Protestants stare across the bloody boundary of small differences that separate them. Their opposition defines the mirrored sameness of their common Irishness as utterly alien. With melodramatic anticipation, both await the moment when violence seals off the expelled other and circumscribes the sacred realm of our metaphysical identity. Fully enshrined, the Protestants and Catholics of Ulster feel the fullness of their humanity. They are now complete, but sadly, they are no longer whole." Bland goes on to situate this mimetic choreography, ritualised feuding, taking this form of marching and rising, in the history of the region, specifically in the last half of the 18th century, in which the sectarian divisions became definitive of the communities. He looks at the situation in County Armagh between 1784 and 1792 as bearing the classical features of a Girardian sacrificial crisis. However, because in this case the common violence of the communities does not find a common victim or scapegoat, they remain divided, not united. Eventually, the need to constrain violence issued in a ritualisation of the sacrificial exchanges between Catholics and Protestants. So what happens when you don't have a scapegoat? That need to canalise or ritualise the violence is still there, and this becomes a ritualisation of symbolic representation of the respective mobilisations. So just as on the Protestant side, the surprise raids in search of illegal arms in the Catholic community, and on the other hand, the defenderist resistance of such displays of dominance and sovereignty. Though the power relation is clearly unequal, both sides operate with a siege mentality that makes them mimetic doubles. Quote, "Marching and rising are the way people deal with fears that would otherwise overwhelm them." I'll leave others to say whether they find Bland's analysis helpful or not. He does go on to talk about how other aspects of mimetic theory can help with resolving situations. I'm just pointing out the diagnosis of some of the troubles. But the recognition there that the violence, there's always a history to acts of violence, and he goes through the history to talk about where these sudden sporadic outpourings of violence have come from, what that history is, in a way that seems to me to be using a Girardian hermeneutic. It's really quite responsible. So I'm impressed with that essay and just want to kind of be interested to see whether anyone wants to comment on that, if you know that text. Let's just move towards some kind of conclusions in terms of situating where we are now. I mentioned this web past, or at least the Schmittian, Hobbesian Girard is overlaid by events, in the sense that the situation we deal with now seems to have a very different quality to it. And what I've tried to do is to articulate Girard's work in terms of the three trajectories, Hegelian, Augustinian, Pauline, in which we can speak of his relation to the political. And then a couple of examples of how Girardian analysis of symbolic religious violence might be related to real violence. Examples of scholars who might show us how that's done. The discussions organised by Juergensmeyer and the case study by Bland offer templates, as it were, of how Girard's mimetic theory might be responsibly applied. The three dimensions can be read as synchronic or diachronic, as a palimpsest, or as a journey of intensification, as they testify to the theological undertow of Girard's thought. Taken in succession, they represent a break with the Hegelian dialectic in favour of an Augustinian narrative of novelistic conversion. The Augustinian paradigm in its turn has to give way as the post-Westphalian collapse of cataconic protections becomes more and more evident. And now only the language of apocalypse and of apocalyptic choice seems to be adequate to our situation. My designation of this third phase as Pauline allows Girardian theory access into one of the most suggestive conversations in contemporary political theology. There is no straightforward sense in which Girard is a political theorist. In his first book, Deceit, Desire and the Novel, and then Violence and the Sacred, he formulates anthropological insights by reading texts. First, his treasured European novelists, then the myths and legends of the history of religion, as evidenced in ancient drama. Texts are in touch with the mechanisms and events that generate social structures and their history. By combining literature with anthropology, with myths, Girard produces a full dramatic sequence. Burton Mack, 1987. So, is this a legitimate way of operating, from moving from fictional to actual violence? Can assertions about violence within symbolic and literary constructs be extrapolated to the real world? Is it plausible that texts are in touch with the mechanisms and events that generate social structures and their history? Even if this license is granted, there remains the objection of Paul Dominac and others like him, who are suspicious of a gift which seems too good, too timely to be true. As a quote from Dominac objecting to the kind of totalizing, as he sees it, totalizing force of Girard's work. If I voice an objection, is it to avoid succumbing to the seductiveness of an audacity that will return Christ on the cross to the centre of the world? It seems to me it is out of fear of meeting up again with some demons I thought I had exorcised. The claim to close off in a global explanation, the myth of a social transparency finally realised, the dream of a city that the Spirit would penetrate and dedicate to the good. In short, a desire to know that does not know its limits, and claims suddenly to illuminate all history, past, present, and yet to come, like a pyrotechnics expert igniting a Catherine wheel. The tragic, in my view, will continue its dialogue with certitude. For there will subsist until the end a share of night that is not the reverse side of day, but the place for the propagation of light. That's Dominac writing in 1988, voicing quite understandable objections about this audacious theory. But it's interesting to read that, his refusal of the tragic in the name of a dogmatic and omniscient certitude. His insistence on the tragic in the face of dramatic and omniscient certitude. But it's interesting how discordant that sounds if you compare that to recent philosophical projects. I'm thinking of Zizek saying that it is perhaps theoretically salient and politically sound to stay with Judeo-Christian logic in the light of the challenges that are facing us. Whether that's New Age mush on the one hand or fascism on the other. Perhaps we stay with Judeo-Christian logic. And then, I don't know if people know this extraordinary talk that Giorgio Agamben gave in Paris at the invitation of the bishops. He gave an address in Notre Dame Cathedral, printed up in 2012. The address was in 2011, where he broadly castigated the church for forgetting its messianic function. So the church is there to connect up the penultimate with the ultimate. And unless we are confronting the world with a different conception of time, unless we are contributing that Pauline insight, then the church is just another institution like any other, and it faces the same crises that other institutions are facing. So this is the exact opposite. Agamben and Zizek and others are arguing that it is in the absence of the theological that we run the risk of closure and totality. Only resistance to such closure will enable us to respond to the injunction of Rowan Williams, insisting that any political theology worthy of the name will reject the barbarism of politics as simply about the assertion of meaningful action. If that's our only understanding of politics, the assertion of meaningful action, then this conjures up the spectre of purist fascism. He wants to conjure up the notion of politics as witness, testimony. It is Jesus done to death at the hands of political and religious meaning makers. In place of this barbarism, Rowan Williams appeals to an understanding of action as testimony and sees theology as the discipline which attends to the supreme act of testimony, and therefore the supremely generative and revisionary act of all human history. The cross for Christians, the gift of Torah and communal identity for Judaism. And just finish up, well, quite going to finish up, the quote following on from Girard. Even well-meaning readers still fail to follow me in my conviction that Judeo-Christianity and the prophetic tradition are the only things that can explain the world in which we live. There is mimetic wisdom, which I do not claim to embody, and it is in Christianity that we have to look for it. It doesn't matter whether we know it or not, the crucifixion is what highlights the victory mechanism and explains history. Just want to add a little bit of a postscript to that, and a very strong assertion of the kind of Christian genesis of the Christian character of mimetic theory. And I want to kind of take that a little bit further. One of the discussions, and this is again achever Girard, moving beyond Girard or moving places where Girard has not directly gone. Conference we had last year trying to look at mimetic theory and Islam. We've got a number of Muslims together saying, what do you make of this then? And a number of colleagues working in Islamic studies. And my colleague, Ahmed Akhtar, who's very sceptical, but he's willing to get engaged with this stuff. And his question to me was, is this set in stone? Is this set in stone? Because if it is, and if you have to be a kind of Christian to get into this, then obviously you're not going to get very far. So, and I want to have conversations with people like Ahmed. I want to talk with him about the resources within the Quran, within Islamic tradition, for doing the kind of things that Girard is pointing out. An example of the kind of transcendence that was being mentioned just before this in the last session. Where the transcendence found, we looked up human rights, and I've got inevitably a fairly kind of Catholic take on a lot of this stuff, and I think a very interesting point of departure for what I want to do and link this up with is something like Nostra Aetate, which is the Catholic Church's recognition that there is salvific wisdom to be found in other faith traditions. This is from the Vatican Council in 1965. It's an important document, it's only 3 pages long, but it asserts for the first time in a formal way that there's goodness to be found, and substantive goodness to be found in other religious traditions. Now, the history of that document is interesting because it started off as a statement about Christian-Jewish relations. The Church, the Council's fathers felt they had to say something about relationship with Jews, especially in the light of the Holocaust. So what starts off as, well, we need to say something about this and clarify how the Church sees this theologically. In other words, to renounce supersessionism, to renounce things like the kind of blood libel and all the rest of it, to really turn this thing around. And once they started doing that, they said, we actually have to say something about other religious traditions as well. So the recognition of the victim, which issued on one hand in terms of the human rights discourse that we now have, to a large extent is kind of post-Shoah, post-Holocaust, has also borne in being the impetus for what is now kind of very thriving kind of industry for theology of Christian-Jewish relations and Christian inter-religious relations and so on. So it seems to be an example of a kind of a hermeneutic intelligence of the victim actually producing new insight. And what's interesting is the irreducibility of the Jewish component of that. Elie Wiesel says you can't have a Christological reading of the Holocaust. You can't see that in Christological terms, because if you do, you're flying in the face of the people who've experienced that. So far as it's not exclusively a Jewish tragedy, but you're using a category that is scandalous and insulting. So you have that irreducible aspect of Jewish experience, of God's dealing with the Jews, mysterious as it is, it cannot be incorporated into a kind of Christological framework. Now, you might want to argue with Wiesel on that, but certainly publicly you can't offer a Christological reading of the Holocaust. And this is where it seems to me that the intelligence of the victim works through once again. That allowing the other to be other and to express themselves as other is one of the fruits of this kind of awareness of the victim. Kind of example, if you like, the kind of thing where it seems to me that Girardian logic takes us. If we're going to take the victim seriously, then we can't impose categories on that. I'm going to stop there, and I'll better try and make some sense. Thank you for enjoying my Irish stew.
Thank you very much, Michael. I don't think I need to make sense out of that. It had plenty inside. Now, I only really will make a couple of comments, and I will end up with a question in really not more than 5 minutes. And they will be all touching upon one element of your talk, but certainly a central, if not the central element, and this question about the apocalyptic term in Girard and what does it mean, and so on. Now the first sort of comment or set of comments are about Hegel and Hölderlin, because in fact the two things are very closely connected, because Hegel and Hölderlin very well knew each other, and in fact Hegel's entire master-slave dialectic can say that can only be understood, but is fundamental to be understood in the context of his relationship to Hölderlin and the French Revolution. It's interesting to notice that, going back to Rites of Passage, that Hegel and Hölderlin were both born in 1770, which means that they were 18, 19 and went to university in the first year of the French Revolution. So what it meant is that their personal liminality, meaning rite of passage, moving, being 18, maturity, coincided with this rite of passage, whatever you call that, at a collective level, which, by the way, Kant sort of anticipated in some kind of way, also in a rather problematic sense of mankind coming to maturity, but mankind coming to maturity is a kind of rite of passage, but I don't think that mankind came to maturity, whether in the Enlightenment or the French Revolution, but certainly Hegel and Hölderlin came to maturity literally in the year of the French Revolution, and so that was their fundamental experience. And they were living in the same year for 3 or 4 years. They went to university together, and the master-slave dialectic, in one level can be understood as Hegel's struggle against Hölderlin, because the master was Hölderlin. And this is what we have to understand, that Hölderlin is the master philosopher, not Hegel. Hegel stole the ideas of Hölderlin, and Hölderlin's madness was a result of Hegel stealing and going into public with his ideas, not exactly like that, but that is the issue. So suddenly the slave, Hegel, who was a mediocre thinker, we keep thinking that Hegel was a great thinker. No, Hegel was a very mediocre thinker who took all the ideas of Hölderlin, and when Hölderlin was sort of felt emptied by that, and then Hegel went into a direction that Hölderlin didn't, and made himself as the pompous master thinker of the French Revolution, while Hölderlin realized and came painfully to realize, for example, in this extraordinary work, which is the Hyperion, of that entire thing is collapsing. That's when Hegel come up with this another pompous and terrible kind of claim about Napoleon, the world spirit on a horseback. I mean, can a thinker say like that? Imagine a real thinker, Nietzsche, Foucault, Max Weber, saying something like that. They cannot. This is just, it's going on television and primetime TV. Here we have the world spirit. You can realize how mediocre figure Hegel was. He took a lot of ideas to Hölderlin until it lasted. So this is very fundamental to this entire dialectic. And actually Goethe in 1986 in Goethe was very fundamental. Goethe actually saw Napoleon, even talked to him. And then Goethe came up with a very, very Girardian book in some kind of way, Elective Affinities, because it's all about this kind of dynamics and dialectics, and that was before actually Hegel wrote down that, and Goethe had several conversations exactly around that time with Hegel, and he sort of relatively appreciated Hegel. I'm not saying that Hegel was stupid, but just it was Hölderlin who made him great, and then wrote this fantastic novel, Elective Affinities, which is again very different from it. Okay, so Hegel, Hölderlin, this entire dynamics, dialectics was at the beginning of Girard, and he went beyond the entire Hegel logic, rightly, and then he came back to Hölderlin, and that should be really revisited in this entire light, and what Girard made out of Hölderlin, and makes a number of comments which are quite interesting and also somewhat controversial, because to claim that Hölderlin wasn't really influenced by Greek thought, as he's overstretching Hölderlin into making him into a Christian and not a Greek, and that's, but anyway, so that's a very fascinating area, and much linked to the dynamics of Hegel's ideas, and that Hölderlin comes back in this apocalyptic book is very, very significant. But the second point, very shortly, is about this anti-politics, and anti-politics can be meant in a number of different senses, and you certainly don't mean it in the sense of civil society, public sphere kind of quasi-Habermas and sort of arguments. But this interaction of the political and the theological has many dimensions. You mentioned the missile crisis and Khrushchev sort of turning around. You probably know, I'm only saying that because I only knew it very recently when I went into the internet in the occasion of Pope John the 23rd's sanctification, that actually he had a major role in that, because actually he wrote to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev actually acknowledged that. And so that's a kind of extraordinary thing which hardly anybody knows about. People don't know about that. But that was a very fundamental issue that, John felt at that moment that he needs, and he contacted Khrushchev and he contacted whoever, Kennedy, and that had a major impact, and that actually Khrushchev acknowledged. And in the Vatican you can read the letter which Khrushchev wrote to Pope John. So that's again politics and theology at the level of real politics and supposedly real politics. Actually, Harald Widraus, one of the editors of the IP, has a book forthcoming in Cambridge University Press, which is called Politics and the Sacred, and Harald is very strongly influenced by Girard and other things, so he's covering many of these areas. Now the third issue, and this is where I have the question, and which should be the central, it's about what we mean by apocalypse, and is it, because there are three things which are seemingly the same and yet they have very different connotations. Really, I'm posing this question, is the second coming and the apocalypse is the same, or is eschatology and apocalypse is the same? Because they evoke very different kind of ideas and connotations, and it's are they the same, or when Girard is talking, because he's having this kind of apocalyptic mood, but he never really mentions the second coming, and there is something strange about that, because in the first centuries, of course, the second coming was expected every day. Now it is the evangelicals who are somewhat problematic features in all kinds of real contemplation who is expecting it. And so I'm really confused about all of that, and I know that it cannot be sorted out, but if you can at least try, I would appreciate.
Thank you. Yes, no, it's
sort of the second coming, but
Give the
date.
Yes, the date.
give us a date.
And to some extent, that's one of the frustrations with the entirety of Girard's corpus, that he situates things at a level where language is not very precise. So desire, I mean, what does he mean by desire? And sometimes he tries to find a different word. He says, no, I'm talking about desire, and we'll stay with that. Sacrifice was the other example where there's a whole semantic field that has to be worked with. And apocalypse is the other one. And my attempt to kind of grapple with this, I did ask some of my biblical studies scholars and colleagues, and one of the things that they would pick up, and we think of apocalyptic literature as stuff that's directly related to the end of the world. In fact, the scripture scholars would say, well, actually, it's more directed towards a manifestation of God or theophany. So when Paul is describing, for example, his experience of being taken up into heaven, his experience of God, that would count as apocalypse. So that's an interesting discussion. If apocalypse literally means unveiling or revealing, and it might not necessarily have to do with unveiling at the end of time, but it's describing lifting the lid on things that get unveiled. So I think once you see that there are other ways of talking about it, then that's helpful. James Allison is one of the foremost scholars, draws a distinction between apocalypse and eschatology. And this goes against it. He says apocalypse that's the popular bad stuff that's left behind type of rapture stuff. You get all the resentment, this disguised resentment, or undisguised resentment of the good people will be lifted up and everyone else will be left to suffer. And there's plenty of examples of that delineation. It's a sacrificial mechanism. Is it Tertullian somewhere? It warns about he's trying to wean people off the games. They're all going off to the gladiatorial shows and says, no, don't go to those games. Hang on till the end of time, and then you'll have a front row seat in heaven, and you'll be able to watch people being tortured down in hell. And just wait, and you'll get the real thing. So there's that version of apocalypse, which is very popular, and it's basically sacrificial. Eschatology for James is the exact opposite. It's seen with the eyes of the victim. It's the revelation that takes place when you kind of see God's face in the victim. It's a different thing entirely. So one possible thing is to take a distinction between eschatology and apocalypse and work with eschatology. But other Girardians are all using the word apocalypse, so that confuses things a little bit. I think there's also an issue with how we read this last book of the Bible. It's called Revelation, and it's at the end. So we used to think of that as a kind of climax. Whereas in fact, you want to actually say, well, the heart of the gospel the heart of the New Testament is the Christian revelation, it's the teachings of Christ, it's the crucifixion. And we need to read the book of Revelation in the light of the crucifixion rather than the other way around. So, for example, there are passages in the book of Revelation which are just kooky. There's one point where I think the two witnesses are killed, who may or may not be Peter and Paul, and they're suddenly raised from the dead, and then 3,000 people are killed in an earthquake or a volcano or something. And there's lots of stuff going on that's not very helpful. But you have to read that in the light of what the crucifixion tells us about God. The crucifixion and resurrection tells us about God and God's purposes, rather than seeing the book of Revelation as a kind of summation of the Bible. I mean, the book of Revelation is full of resentment. It's written by a community that is under the cosh, and bits of that are looking forward to the great triumph when the great whore will be destroyed and cast into the depths.
It's the joining word, not reveal. Reveal is that everything is about truth being revealed. Revelation is the point about apocalypse. Apocalypse is in the popular imagination this great violent implosion of divine violence. I understand it in Girardian terms as the culmination of going on with violence if we don't stop, and the revelation of the alternative of the possibility. And it is this problematic of violence at the core of human relations as to what do we do if we don't prevent escalatory violence to the point of what's then the other version of apocalypse that it all pulls in. But the purpose, as I understand it, the New Testament is to reveal that as human agency. This is human agency. This isn't, God is not this. God is actually the one on the cross. God is the one saying, don't do this. It's the reversal, actually, of what counts as Christian fundamentalism now, which is, there's some divine, you get in Hollywood version of the apocalypse. And that's what I understand by the truth, the way, the life. It's not a divine impulse being legalized on us or worked through. It is this breaking into history of the choice, the revelation of what we have to choose here. And it is quite absolute. It is quite born again at a certain moment. But it's a different type of a version of a choice than what the Christians tell us we have to make.
The fact that we're dealing with the ecological crisis as something that's cosmically visiting us, and yet we're also partly responsible as part of the equation.
When you were talking earlier, I don't want to go too long, but it strikes me that there are now our own four horsemen are the environmental thing, which is catching us kind of out of the side of our eye here, and we all see it and we don't really know what to do about that one. The war thing, the technology of war, which is becoming so minimalised now that you can do it off your computer. I mean, if we get printers, 3D printers, well, can't you not print eventually? And the nanotechnology and all of that kind of stuff is becoming on a scale which I cannot, it's out of control anyway. I don't know where law applies in this area anymore. So that's technology and war. I suppose technology as well is kind of running to the point where, I don't know, certainly differentiation crisis about place, and we're not living in one spot anymore.
And I think the same thing.
You're probably right.
I mean, the war has always been I grew up in the 80s. The idea that with one finger the entire world would be blown up by it's always been like this. I don't think it's any worse than.
That's why I was just going to flag up the possibility, without in any way, minimising the challenges. I think this stuff does read a little bit differently in an American context than a European, and I may be overstating this, but I do think that Girard was very shaken by the 9/11 thing, and to some extent you might say that those later critiques are coming out of that sense of helplessness or incomprehensibility. Maybe I'm pushing that too far to.
I really liked your thoughts about the cosmic, the change and the change from a humanistic to a cosmic and the unpredictability. But I still, I can't think it through here, but for some reason I just want to deconstruct that. I don't think that ultimately it's any different, or that it's no worse than it's always been, or better.
Well, are we willing to bet on that?
Where does...
What do you mean by always? Yeah. Because that maybe there's an atomic bomb or something like that. But
I'm warming to the theme of the apocalypse. But a couple of points. First point, I wonder if there's too much talk of an apocalyptic turn in Girard. I've been reading quite closely the Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World book, and it's pretty apocalyptic.
Dostoevsky, going way back to Dostoevsky and Apocalypse, so yes.
Yeah, exactly. And in the Things Hidden book, really his main example is the sort of nuclear deterrent scenario of, so it's very 70s, but it's still very much apocalyptic, and with this sort of revelatory connotation of, in addition to the argument seems to be that, what Judeo-Christianity is doing is not just revealing, it's also in the sense that you were talking about, once you take the lid off the scenario, you then do invite, it's almost like a meltdown religion, you invite the more chaotic possibilities through actually relinquishing the previous religious mechanisms for keeping things at bay. So for Girard, that is, it seems to me the source of the appeal of the apocalyptic theme is that it's part of the story of once we do reveal these mechanisms, we increasingly only have a choice of reform, as it were, or apocalypse. But that's not that's not really an important issue of whether he had a turn or not, is it?
But an intensification might be a better description.
Yeah, this thing that I was talking about earlier about you can polarize it to some extent. You've got the transcendent theme traditionally dealt with by religion. You've got the empirical theme traditionally dealt with by science, and we've had this sort of moment with Hobbes, let's say, for ease of access to the issue, where we give up the transcendent, and and Hobbes's take on rationality, it seems to be, isn't what Girard sort of was laughing at when he was parading it as an English affectation of which will sort out this problem. I think the Hobbesian retranslation of rationality is we rid ourselves of the transcendental rationality, so the Platonic rationality, the big picture rationality, and we only allow access to the Fox-like Ulysses strategic rationality, but the strategic rationality of looking after your self-interest. is what Hobbes wants us to identify with, and that's why Hobbes wants to sort of get rid of any forms of thinking that deter us from the sheer self-interested rationality of realising what our best bet is to do given human nature.
Yeah.
Our best bet is to form up in the Leviathan, to give up the big picture questions. In other words, the transcendent is forbidden by Hobbes. You know, the transcendent is only something that can be imposed from above on the basis of his rationalistic philosophy. And so from that point on, in a sense, religion is placed into a deep freeze. It hardly develops, or it's almost an embarrassment to develop it. But whereas, of course, if you argue that the whole business is moving from the empirical to the transcendentalist, it's some sort of dialogue between the stuff that's taken care of by religion and the stuff that's taken care of by science. And from that point, you've got a sort of scientific worldview that develops, and religion is just sort of left to the individual. Although it's picked up, I suppose, in interesting ways. Like for me, the interesting sort of figures in people like Kierkegaard or William James or Whitehead, who are writing about, you know, rethinking a form of religion, but are thinking about it as a very individual phenomena. So it's a sort of almost the apotheosis of a Protestantism in James and Whitehead and Kierkegaard, but still a very interesting sort of take on religion. But the question becomes, you know, how do you re-engage with religion as something that we're always in the business of having to reinvent and get a better version of, rather than accept as a transcendent, let's say. And Girard is very interesting to me precisely because he's approaching it in this really rational and empirical way. He's saying, well, you know, you can. I've gone through things hidden from the foundation of the world with a fine-tooth comb for any sort of metaphysical take on religion, and it's just not there. You know,
He leaves that to the theologians.
Yeah, he says it reveals human truth. Absolutely, it does it in a humanistic way.
Yes, so that leaves open the question of well, what then is the most adequate way of rethinking how we conceive of the preserve of religion, let's say. In other words, the question of how you think the transcendental, or the principle of coordinating things, how you order and organise things rather than how you break them up into bits. And that seems to me, you know, in a sense, as I'm coming at it not as from a theological perspective, but from the perspective, you know, of a social scientist who sort of finds himself
stuck in this language.
Yeah, and also fascinated by the sort of the reintroduction of these questions of religion, you know. But so I just wanted to sort of push you on that sort of, that, you know, rather than us seeing, oh, well, this proves the Catholic point, and so great, we're happy, and we might concede some of it to the Muslims, and we might concede a little bit here to the, you know, rather than that sort of, which is almost a sort of congratulatory, oh yeah, now this keeps us going, this gives us a new lease of life, and that's what's great about Girard. Rather than that, you could see it as a profound challenge to any sort of religious thinking to get itself into gear and actually to take seriously the challenge of articulating an adequate account of the transcendent.
You can take how far back you want to go. I mean, where did we lose our way in terms of this? One highly plausible account for me is the idea that moving away from a Trinitarian account of God is the point at which we move away from a participationist notion of, and then turn back to kind of, the kind of nominalism and so on. But the idea that we have been connected, or there's been a sense of connection, and somehow we've got it into the system that, you know, God has to be something out there, God is something, or the transcendent is this realm. Can you get, once you've identified the realm as there, and therefore possibly to be rejected, that's what's going to happen, because once you identify the transcendent as something that's outside and beyond, you've still got it on with your everyday life, and actually you realise you don't need the transcendent. So unless you can recover, I can't go back, unless we recover that sense of somehow participating in the transcendent and not seeing ourselves locked in rivalry with it, then...
My answer to that question though is, goes to something you said earlier, is what stuck in my head is this thing, which is Christianity is the religion of the exit from religion. In other words, it is essentially a critique of religiosity. And actually part of this is the whole thing, which is if religion is now seen from the side of the victim, then it is essentially exposed for what it is as a mechanism of social order and control based on, which fundamentally has to resort eventually to violence. And maybe the best way to solve violence, but it's nevertheless that. But it is a kind of exposure. It's kind of shows the light on what is going on. And two points to connect to what Arpad said earlier. Anyway, the Jewish start of this is the I am statement, the non-relational I am statement at the beginning, which can't speak its name actually, although Christianity gives its name as Jesus. Actually, I think that's the answer, is the Christian answer, is that Jewish problematic. And that's what it looks like. But it is liminal. it's in here, but it's there. It's on the edge. And this notion of the resurrection, which permeates Christianity to me, is, well, what does come back then? What comes back? It is something post crucifixion. This from the other side, from outside, which is radically different, but has to do with victim, and we see it in our victims, in suffering, in the human. That paradoxically puts the human person into the centre of our concern of ethics. It doesn't put history into the concern of ethics. It puts the human person into the concern of ethics and inverts it.
And that's what I understand by this figural or typological relation. Patterson related. Christ is every victim that's ever been. It's not that he represents or stands in for, but he is, and that's a participationist view of language, which I think Girard into it.
You said two extremely important things. We are getting very late, but anyway. And two very, one was the resurrection and the participation. And that gives answer to many different things. Because the resurrection, in fact, is people are less willing to talk about, but we are among theologians. So it's not just the crucifixion as an event, but there is also resurrection, and that's sort of beyond. And that's when the participatory and the Trinitarian dimension comes. And the participation is also extremely important, because the participation is as opposed to the spectator dimension. And here we have this, which is one of the other crucial elements when the error component comes in, and that's the spectator dimension. And the spectator dimension and the sort of extreme importance and the crucifixion effect as opposed to the resurrection, they're all Byzantine. And they all go back to very long traditions, and so this is this kind of Byzantine, if you want, bug which became inserted in many kind of ways, and the spectator is very clear, and that goes back to the hippodrome and all this sort of thing. And this vision, when by now, and then we go back even to Adam Smith and Kant, the idea that morality assumes the spectator. It's a very, very serious error. So modern moral philosophy is simply corrupt. The core of Kant and Adam Smith is corrupt. It's very rarely realized, because it assumes the spectator, and it proclaims that in order to be truly moral, we have to be spectators. We cannot participate, which is nonsense. But it's evident nonsense. But it's we are raised in that. And so this is where the Trinitarian, because the God as a kind of spectator, and this is a fundamentally Byzantine vision. This is what Christopherus transmitted in the early 15th century to Europe, that this is the ultimate position. We can be gods if we are spectators. So morality if you are spectator. You can be God if you are spectators. And that's really the calm and impartial spectator who is above us and not participating. And that's the rejection of the Trinitarian kind of vision, and how far you can trace it back into, and that is the schismatic element, and not wanting to go too much into theology, but the entire homoousion kind of debate, Arianism, but also it's all about this, the consubstantiality, it's about, is Christ just a God-like kind of thing, and it's, something very, very fundamental here, and it all goes back to the same kind of questions about away from this distant, spectator-like, and this kind of technological, alchemic scientism, when we dismount everything, reconnect, and then after all, it's just the computers who decide everything. They wage the wars, they fix the markets, and we just sit here enjoying the... I don't want to say what, but...
We know about Friday. We know that violence exists. The question is there Sunday? And we're sitting in Saturday. And you take your choice.
But there's maybe it's a naive image that I have of sort of there seems to be sort of two stances that you can take on transcendence and so on.
Yeah.
One is you say, well, it's out there, and you have a picture of it already, which for me goes with the sort of spectatorial division, where you have a spectator, but it's not expected to be a participant, and you're able to take that position because you've made that split. The other is a more simple thing. It's we are actually parts of a bigger relational whole, but as parts we only see, especially when we're just born, a tiny little bit of it. As we get bigger, we begin to understand that we're implicated in it in more complicated ways. Transcendence is simply that movement towards understanding more and more our implication within a broader whole that we are actually participants in, whether or not we know it. And at first we don't know it at all, but gradually we come to know more and more about it. So the question of how you achieve transcendence is the question of how you come to a better appreciation of your embeddedness within a broader relational totality, which ultimately must extend to the universe, if you like. If you think of it simply in scientific terms, we're part of a rather large unity. So a very simple way of grasping that is early ways of grasping that is in terms of these sort of religious metaphorics, but we can maybe work out, more useful ways of grasping that process of coming to a transcendent. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, in formal terms, I wonder what brings you back around to kind of Kafka. Yes. Well, like Kafka as an example, but the wider point being literature as a form. Yeah. A kind of new. Well, the potential for religion to be recognised as a new, or potential for literature to be recognised as a new religious, form in itself, and what you would have to do, how far you would have to push in order for that to, or whether already that's the case, or how far you would have to push it in order for that claim to be made, and how long the validity of that claim would stand up in the face of the inevitable corruption, that would take hold once you had tried to. Establish some kind of platform there, but it certainly it makes it interesting.
Possibly one of them too. If you understand this now as faith, in other words, it's forward-looking, it's into a certain degree of uncertainty, and literature is part of that process of bringing that back to us. But science might be too, might it be?
But then does it?
Or is it not?
For me, it's both. It's not the apocalyptic, it's the post-apocalyptic, which there is no religion, there's no science, there's nothing, there's bare life. Or it's Cormac McCarthy's The Road. That's all I can think about this whole time. So how can we have apocalypse as the end of everything when we also have the post-apocalyptic?